What if I told you that Final Fantasy VII was almost nothing like the game we know today? Imagine a detective story set in a futuristic city, where a private investigator uncovers a dark conspiracy behind Mako reactor explosions. No Cloud, no Buster Sword, no legendary rivalry with Sephiroth. Sounds unbelievable, right? But that was almost the version of Final Fantasy VII we got. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of gaming's most legendary titles, uncovering shocking behind-the-scenes decisions, near-impossible challenges, and the risks that shaped this masterpiece. Trust me, you won't look at Final Fantasy VII the same way again. The success of Final Fantasy VI set high expectations, and in 1994, Square began planning its next big project. Initially, Final Fantasy VII was envisioned as a traditional 2D RPG for the Super Nintendo, continuing the legacy of its predecessors. But as the team explored their ideas, it became clear that the limitations of cartridge-based technology wouldn't allow them to push the boundaries of what they wanted to achieve. A bigger world, richer storytelling, and more cinematic moments, none of it would be possible unless they took a different approach. At first, Final Fantasy VII was nothing like the game we know today. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the mind behind the series, had a completely different vision. Instead of a futuristic fantasy setting, he imagined a modern detective story set in New York City in 1999. The game's protagonist wasn't Cloud, but a private investigator unraveling a mystery tied to explosions at Mako reactors. This concept, while fascinating, didn't fit the scale and ambition that Square was aiming for, and as development progressed, the idea was ultimately scrapped. Interestingly, some of these early concepts found new life in other games. The idea of a dark, urban environment inspired Parasite Eve, while elements of the cast were repurposed, most notably, the design of Edea, who later became a central character in Final Fantasy VIII. But development faced another major challenge. Square's key talent was already busy with Chrono Trigger, a project that had its own tight deadlines. With so many resources focused elsewhere, Final Fantasy VII was temporarily put on hold. In hindsight, this delay was a blessing in disguise. By the time the project was revived, the industry was on the verge of a technological revolution, the transition from cartridges to CDs. Even before official details emerged, rumors about Final Fantasy VII spread like wildfire through gaming magazines. In early 1995, one publication even claimed that the game would use pre-rendered graphics similar to Donkey Kong Country, hinting at a potential Super Nintendo release. Of course, the final version would be nothing like that, but this speculation reflected how eager fans were for any information about the next entry in the legendary RPG series. For years, Final Fantasy had been synonymous with Nintendo. The series had thrived on the NES and Super Nintendo, making it almost unthinkable that Square would break away. But times were changing, and staying loyal to Nintendo presented a growing problem: cartridges. Unlike CDs, cartridges had severe storage limitations, restricting the size and complexity of games. They were also expensive to produce, which meant higher costs for developers and less flexibility for ambitious projects like Final Fantasy VII. At the time, Nintendo wasn't particularly interested in expanding the RPG market outside of Japan, seeing greater profits in other genres. Square, on the other hand, had a much bigger vision. They wanted to take Final Fantasy global, and that meant finding a platform that could support their ambitions. The choice was clear. Final Fantasy VII needed to break free from its past and embrace the future of gaming. By late 1995, Square went all in. The project became a top priority with over 120 developers working on it, and an unprecedented budget of more than $45 million. Leading the charge was Yoshinori Kitase, who had previously directed Final Fantasy VI. For him, moving to 3D wasn't just a technological leap, it was a necessary evolution. The industry was advancing rapidly, and if the Final Fantasy franchise didn't embrace innovation, it risked falling behind. Square knew that Final Fantasy VII needed to push boundaries, but before making any major decisions, they had to test the waters. That's when they created Final Fantasy SGI, a tech demo using Silicon graphics workstations. This short prototype featured characters from Final Fantasy VI rendered in 3D, battling in real time. It wasn't a playable game, just an experiment, but it gave a glimpse into what the future of the series could look like. The results were impressive, proving that 3D visuals could take RPGs to an entirely new level. But there was one big problem. Square still didn't know which platform would be powerful enough to handle their vision. Hey guys, before we continue, if you're enjoying this content and want to help support the channel, check out the links in the description. Any purchase you make after clicking, whether it's gaming gear, collectibles, or even everyday items, helps us at no extra cost to you. It's a simple way to support the channel and keep these deep dives coming. Thanks for your support, and now, let's get back to it. At the time, several options were on the table. The Nintendo 64 was the most obvious choice, considering Final Fantasy's long history with Nintendo. But its cartridge format posed a serious limitation. Cartridges had minimal storage capacity, making it nearly impossible to include the large-scale worlds, cinematic cutscenes, and detailed character models that Square wanted to implement. Then there was the Sega Saturn, which used CDs but struggled with 3D rendering due to its complex hardware. The PC was another possibility, but Square had little experience in developing for Western computer markets. And then came Sony. The company had just entered the gaming industry with the PlayStation, a system built entirely around CD technology. This wasn't just about better graphics. CDs offered an immense advantage in storage space, were cheaper to produce than cartridges, and allowed developers more creative freedom. The PlayStation was designed with 3D gaming in mind, making it the perfect match for what Square wanted to achieve. But before making a final decision, Square showcased the Final Fantasy SGI demo at SIGGRAPH, a major technology conference in Los Angeles. While most attendees were focused on film and military-grade simulations, gaming journalists were stunned. The press mistakenly assumed that the demo was an early build of a Final Fantasy game in development for the Nintendo 64, sparking a wave of speculation. This moment made something crystal clear. If Square wanted to deliver a game of that caliber, they had to abandon cartridges. The choice was made. Final Fantasy VII would move to CDs, and with that, Square parted ways with Nintendo. It was a risky move, but one that would change gaming history forever. Meanwhile, Sony saw an opportunity. They needed a major title to solidify the PlayStation as a true competitor, and securing Final Fantasy VII as an exclusive would be a game-changer. Square had its platform, Sony had its killer app, and the stage was set for one of the most important shifts in the gaming industry. Sony was a newcomer in the gaming industry, and to compete with giants like Nintendo and Sega, they needed a game that would turn the PlayStation into a must-have console. Securing Final Fantasy VII as an exclusive wasn't just a win, it was a statement. Unlike Nintendo, which enforced strict licensing fees and creative restrictions, Sony gave developers full control over their projects. But beyond choosing a platform, Final Fantasy VII needed a bold new visual identity. For years, the series had been defined by the ethereal art of Yoshitaka Amano, whose dreamlike designs gave Final Fantasy its unique aesthetic. Once again, he was brought in to create the game's promotional artwork and logo. After experimenting with several designs, the team settled on the now iconic meteor symbol, a striking image that captured both the game's scale and its underlying themes of destruction and rebirth. Another key creative force behind the game was Tetsuya Nomura, a designer with a fresh and unconventional approach. While most concept artists submitted structured, formal designs, Nomura's hand-drawn sketches were dynamic and full of personality. His work caught the attention of Hironobu Sakaguchi, earning him the role of lead character designer. This was his first time leading the design of a Final Fantasy game, but his bold vision would become one of its defining elements. Nomura didn't just create visually striking characters, he infused them with symbolism and depth. One of his biggest influences was the legendary rivalry between Samurai Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojiro. Cloud, like Musashi, fights with instinct and brute strength, wielding an oversized weapon with unpolished yet effective movements. Sephiroth, on the other hand, mirrors Kojiro's refined, almost effortless precision, turning every strike of his long katana into something calculated and lethal. This contrast wasn't just aesthetic, it defined their entire dynamic, turning their battle into one of the most iconic rivalries in gaming. Early drafts of the story also contained fascinating concepts that were eventually discarded. One of the most surprising? Aerith and Sephiroth were originally meant to be siblings. While this idea never made it into the final script, traces of it remained in their character designs. Their hairstyles and facial features share subtle similarities, hinting at the remnants of this abandoned plotline. This is just one of many examples of how Final Fantasy VII's development was constantly evolving, with ideas being reshaped, repurposed, or scrapped entirely in pursuit of the perfect story. Among the many unforgettable moments in Final Fantasy VII, few have sparked as much discussion as the scene aboard the Highwind near the end of the game. Cloud and Tifa share a private moment, filled with unspoken words and deep emotion. The game subtly hints that their bond reaches a new level that night, but originally this scene was meant to be far less ambiguous. Early drafts of the script left no room for interpretation. Instead of merely implying intimacy, the developers planned for Cloud and Tifa to emerge from a chocobo stable the next morning, visibly flustered, with wrinkled clothes, making it obvious what had transpired. However, concerns over the game's rating led to a more subtle approach. Even so, the moment retained its emotional weight, cementing Cloud and Tifa's relationship as one of the game's most defining connections. But Cloud and Tifa's moment wasn't the only major change during development. Two fan-favorite characters, Vincent and Yuffie, almost didn't make it into the game at all. Time constraints forced Square to find a workaround. Rather than cutting them entirely, they were made optional party members, allowing their stories to be explored through side quests rather than the main plot. Despite this, both characters developed a cult following, with many players considering them essential to the full Final Fantasy VII experience. Not all of the game's pivotal moments were the result of design choices alone. Some were deeply personal. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of the Final Fantasy series, was dealing with profound grief after losing his mother. This loss shaped one of the game's most powerful themes, the life stream. The idea that life energy returns to the planet after death became a way for Sakaguchi to process his emotions, turning his pain into a core aspect of the story. But the most shocking narrative decision came from Tetsuya Nomura. He believed that for the game's themes to truly resonate, loss had to feel real, permanent. In most games, death is reversible, but Final Fantasy VII had to be different. Someone important had to die. Nomura wanted a moment that couldn't be undone, and for it to have impact, it had to be a character the players truly cared about. And the result is one of the most heartbreaking moments in gaming history. When Aerith is taken from the player in an instant without warning, it feels devastating. It wasn't just a plot twist, it was an emotional gut punch. Even today, few moments in gaming have left such a lasting impact, proving that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that aren't afraid to break hearts. Final Fantasy VII was a turning point for the gaming industry, and one of the biggest reasons for its impact was its groundbreaking visual presentation. Square took an ambitious approach, blending polygonal characters with highly detailed pre-rendered backgrounds. This combination allowed for a level of immersion never seen before in an RPG, making every environment feel rich and atmospheric. But what truly set the game apart were its full-motion videos. These cinematic cutscenes added an emotional depth and spectacle that made the story feel larger than life. To achieve this, Square didn't just rely on its in-house team. It created an entirely new studio dedicated to high-quality computer graphics. This division, later known as Visual Works, brought in talent from some of Hollywood's biggest productions, including Star Wars, Jurassic Park, and Terminator 2. The goal was clear: push the boundaries of what video games could look like and deliver an experience that felt like an interactive movie. Even though the move to 3D was exciting, not everyone at Square was convinced. Some developers believed the series should stick to 2D sprites like Xenogears to preserve the classic feel of past Final Fantasy games. But polygonal characters offered something revolutionary: the ability to convey emotions in ways that sprites simply couldn't. A major influence in this decision was Alone in the Dark, a 1992 game that pioneered the use of 3D models on pre-rendered backgrounds. Square saw the potential and committed fully to the new technology, ensuring that Final Fantasy VII would set a new standard for RPGs. Beyond its cinematic presentation, Final Fantasy VII also brought major innovations to its battle system. While it retained the active time battle, or ATB system from previous entries, it introduced limit breaks, a mechanic that added an entirely new layer of strategy and excitement. These powerful, character-specific attacks charged up as party members took damage, rewarding players for surviving tough encounters and turning the tide of battle in critical moments. It wasn't just a flashy addition, it became one of the most defining features of the game, influencing future Final Fantasy titles and countless other RPGs. But visuals were only half of the equation. The soundtrack had to match the scale and ambition of the game, and that responsibility fell on Nobuo Uematsu. With only 8 months to compose an entire orchestral score, the challenge was immense. Looking back, Uematsu admitted that he wished he had at least a year, but despite the tight deadline, he delivered one of the most iconic soundtracks in gaming history. Originally, Square planned to use fully orchestrated tracks, and even incorporate voice acting in some songs. However, this would have significantly increased loading times, which was unacceptable for a game of this scale. Instead, Uematsu opted for a MIDI-based system, carefully refining each composition to push the PlayStation's audio capabilities to their absolute limit. He drew inspiration from bold, intense works like The Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky, giving the music a dramatic and almost cinematic quality. And from this creative process came one of the most legendary video game tracks ever composed, One-Winged Angel. Unlike traditional compositions, this piece wasn't written in a linear fashion. Uematsu spent a week creating separate musical segments without a clear structure in mind. Only later did he stitch them together into a single, cohesive piece, resulting in a powerful, chaotic, and unforgettable theme. The use of choral chants, heavy orchestration, and shifting tempos made it unlike anything ever heard in a video game. Even today, One-Winged Angel remains one of the most celebrated and instantly recognizable tracks in gaming history, sending chills down the spine of anyone who hears it. Square had the technology, the story, and the ambition, but there was one major problem: Japanese RPGs had never been truly mainstream outside of Japan. In the United States, the largest gaming market at the time, RPGs were still considered niche. Previous Final Fantasy titles had small but loyal followings, but their sales numbers were nowhere near those of action-heavy games. If Final Fantasy VII was going to succeed globally, it needed to do something no RPG had ever done before: break into the mainstream. The solution? A marketing strategy unlike anything the genre had seen. Instead of positioning Final Fantasy VII as a slow, turn-based RPG, Square and Sony decided to present it as a high-intensity cinematic action game. The TV commercials focused almost entirely on CGI cutscenes, showcasing the game's dramatic story, large-scale battles, and breathtaking visuals. Turn-based combat was barely mentioned. The goal was clear: attract players who normally wouldn't even consider an RPG. But Sony didn't stop there. They launched one of the most aggressive marketing campaigns in gaming history, spending millions to promote Final Fantasy VII across television, magazines, and even mainstream brands. One of the most unexpected moves was a partnership with Pepsi, bringing the game into the everyday lives of consumers far beyond traditional gaming spaces. This wasn't just an RPG anymore, it was becoming a pop culture event. To generate even more hype, Square took an unconventional approach with the media. Western journalists were flown to Japan months before the game's release, giving them exclusive access to behind-the-scenes content and early gameplay. When they returned home, their previews painted Final Fantasy VII as nothing short of revolutionary. The anticipation skyrocketed. And then came the final stroke of genius, getting the game directly into players' hands before launch. Square bundled a playable demo with Tobal No. 1, a lesser-known fighting game. The result? Many gamers bought Tobal just to get a taste of Final Fantasy VII. It was proof that the hype wasn't just marketing noise, players were desperate to experience this game. The results were staggering. Within just 3 months, Final Fantasy VII had sold over 1 million copies in the United States and another 2 million in Europe. By the end of its life cycle on the PlayStation 1, it had surpassed 13 million units, numbers unheard of for an RPG at the time. The game didn't just succeed, it transformed the Western gaming landscape, proving that RPGs could be global blockbusters. Final Fantasy VII wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural shift, redefining what players expected from video games forever. The impact of Final Fantasy VII didn't end with its release, it only grew stronger with time. What started as a single game expanded into an entire universe, with the compilation of Final Fantasy VII bringing spin-off games, anime adaptations, CGI movies, and novels that explored the deeper layers of its story. Decades later, the world of Gaia continues to captivate fans, proving that this was never just another RPG, it was a phenomenon. But Final Fantasy VII didn't just change gaming, it influenced pop culture as a whole. Its characters, story, and themes have been referenced in countless other games, anime, and even Hollywood films. Cloud's Buster Sword became an icon, instantly recognizable even to those who never played the game. Sephiroth's theme, One Winged Angel, is one of the most performed video game tracks in orchestras worldwide. The game set a new gold standard for RPGs, proving they could be cinematic, emotionally deep, and commercially successful on a global scale. And the legacy continues. Even today, Final Fantasy VII inspires new generations of developers and players. Its remake brought a fresh perspective to the story, reintroducing it to a modern audience while keeping the spirit of the original alive. Now I want to hear from you. What's your favorite moment from Final Fantasy VII? Drop a comment below, we read and reply to every single one. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep bringing you more content like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.